everyone. I'm Robyn Blumner, President and CEO of the Center for Inquiry, and it's my distinct pleasure to welcome you to another edition of Skeptical Inquirer Presents. Now, before we get to the main event, I have just a few items to share with you. So first, our amazing Skepticism Conference is now open for registration. That's SciCon, and it will be held this year in Las Vegas from October 26th through the 29th. Headlining this conference this year will be the legendary Penn and Teller and the wonderful evolutionary biologist Richard Dawkins. So please register at csiconference.org. Also, if you're not already a subscriber, please consider subscribing to Skeptical Inquirer magazine. It's the preeminent magazine of scientific skepticism. You can subscribe by going to skepticalinquirer.org. There will be some questions at the end, and for those of you who would like to ask a question, please submit it in advance in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And closed captioning is also available, so look for the CC button at the bottom of your screen as well. Okay, now to the main event. I am so excited to introduce you to the authors of a groundbreaking and courageous article that recently appeared in the pages of Skeptical Inquirer magazine. It has rightly received a great deal of positive attention. Richard Dawkins lauded it and tweeted it out, and commentator Andrew Sullivan called it brilliant, which is an apt description. Now, if the Center for Inquiry is about anything, it is about keeping science free to explore and investigate without being muzzled by ideological restraint. The article our authors wrote is a warning about what is happening now in the biological sciences, where progressive ideology is putting handcuffs on scientific research and making some scientific conclusions too radioactive to even discuss. Jerry Coyne is Professor Emeritus in the Department of Ecology and Evolution at the University of Chicago. He also writes a terrific daily website newsletter called Why Evolution is True that everyone should subscribe to. It's free. Luana Maroja is an evolutionary biologist and professor at Williams College and is a true courageous voice on how the ideological left is infecting and damaging science. Together, Jerry and Luana wrote the cover article in the July-August edition of Skeptical Inquirer magazine, and it's titled The Ideological Subversion of Biology. New dogmas pose a grave threat to science by forcing reality to conform to progressive politics and morals. Jerry and Luana, welcome to Skeptical Inquirer Presents.
Hi.
Hi there. So let's start off with this. Would you tell us just in broad strokes what your article is about and how you came to write it?
Sure. So the idea for this paper, I guess it started when we were in the Stanford conference last fall. And we are all concerned about this ideological intrusion, which is starting to come to biology. And of course, we see this more in the media and the public understanding of teaching rather than just research. But things are interconnected. So what starts in the media teaching will lead to research, and we are starting to see some of these issues in our societies and in research as well. So
yeah.
Yeah.
You gave a very good introduction yourself to what the paper was about. So I have nothing to add to that, just about the genesis of the paper, if I can use a biblical analogy. We were, as Luana said, we were at the Stanford Conference on Academic Freedom. I guess that was last fall. And we were part of a 4-person panel on academic freedom in STEM. And I've known Luana for a long time. And we've collaborated before. We're sitting next to each other. And I just noticed that while we were talking, we had substantial overlap in our ideas, but also some differences at the same time. So, I mean, I brought up the 6 things. That was my point. Luana was talking about her personal experience trying to teach students biology in the face of, ideological opposition. And afterwards, she wrote a piece, which was put in Barry Weiss's Free Press column and got quite a bit of attention, but it was a short piece. And I figured, well, we should get this message out to a larger audience. And so I asked her if she wanted to collaborate on a big paper about this. I don't know if she knew what she was getting into then, but it happened and you guys got it. So
we sure did. So I have a question, though, about why you focused entirely on progressive ideology suppressing science. Like, why didn't you include all the ways that right-wing ideology also does so? And I'm thinking about limits on stem cell research and how creationism gets injected into evolutionary biology and the anti-vaxxer movement. All those things are also very serious incursions into science.
Well, I'll start it off, but I think Luana has her own ideas. I've always said that my brief is keeping the left clean because I'm a diehard liberal. And what's happened is that the spectrum of liberalism has expanded more to the left. So whereas I used to be right in the center of the left, now I've moved over to the right. And this is wound up with us being called right wing. But there are plenty of people going after the right wing and its incursions in science and everything else. Stuff like global warming, anti-vaxxer, and creationism, which is pretty much dead now. But very few people are going after the problems that they see on the left from a left-wing viewpoint. So I've always seen that as my brief. And another reason is that, well, Luana and I are both evolutionary biologists. We're not experts in global warming. We're not experts in vaccination, although we know a little bit about it. So as we say in the paper, the things that we are defending are attacks on evolutionary biology, which is our own field. So it's a sort of a personal defense of our field against the attacks that we see.
Yeah, and the other aspect is that I am immersed in a very progressive environment. I actually don't encounter very much, I don't have students that will say climate change is not happening or, creationism is true. There's like extremely rare. But I have students that will say many of the things that we're pushing against. So in universities, the right wing is basically gone, right? There's almost nobody left in universities that are even slightly right wing. So we don't encounter those things very often.
Yeah, and I should add that virtually all the attacks on an evolutionary biology, as opposed to these other things like global warming, come from the left. There are very few.
But that's gone. That's dead.
Yeah, I mean, creationism came from the right, and it still comes from the right, but I regard us as having won the battle against creationism. There's no more need, at least I feel, to go after it. So we're defending our field against attacks that are coming from our own ideological corner.
We'll get into the piece very deeply in a minute. And in fact, dropped into the chat is a link to the piece. So if anyone wants to read it in full, it's available on a website. And we made that free as a public service to humanity. But before we get into that, will you tell us how this piece came to be published by Skeptical Inquirer magazine? Why were we lucky enough to get this remarkable article?
Well, yeah, you asked us in our preliminary conversations whether we thought it would be published at all. And my answer, being a secular Jewish pessimist, which is redundant actually, was no, I didn't think it would be published because it was heterodox. It was anti the pervasive so-called progressive, I call it regressive, but I put progressive in quotes. It was against the prevailing sentiment in our field. So I thought, yeah, we're going to have problems getting this published. Where should we get it published? As Luana knows, because we discussed this, we did not have any intention of publishing it in a scientific journal because we knew that they would not accept something like this. I made a few preliminary inquiries, but it became clear that this was radioactive to them, and it's not suitable for a scientific journal. It is meant to be read by the general public. This is one of the criticisms that we get, by the way. Well, if this paper had been any good, it would have been published in a scientific journal. People will find any excuse to go after it, but the fact is we never seriously considered that possibility. We thought it needed public exposure in a public journal. We tried a couple of magazines that actually, I'm not going to name them, but people would be familiar with them, which actually were interested in them. But in negotiating with them, we ran into some snags, as you might expect, about what we could say and what we could not say. And at the end, we just decided to say, oh, forget it. And that's when you stepped in, Robyn. And I think I sent you the piece just for your perusal, and you liked it and offered to publish it. And to us, that was a good solution because we didn't have to fight over what was in it and what was not in it. And we had a pleasant interlude of back and forth. So we're happy with where it came out.
Well, we couldn't have be happier, and it's such an important piece and so courageous. So thank you both for writing it. So let's go through it because there are 6 what you call misconceptions that the political left has embraced that result in attacks on scientific truth in the field of evolutionary biology. So we're going to go through each one so you can give the audience a real understanding of what you have to say and why you're saying it. So the first misconception, and Jerry, I think you're going to take this, is sex in humans is not a discrete and binary distribution of males and females, but a spectrum.
Yeah, that's a very common one. In fact, it's perhaps the most common and also the most fatuous, I think, of these arguments because it's so easily refuted. I mean, when you work with fruit flies or birds or chickens or anything like that, you don't say, well, sex in chickens is a spectrum. You have the hens and you have the cocks, and it's only in humans where this problem comes up. And the claim is, yes, that sex is a spectrum. In reality, and Luana, feel free to jump in if you supplement this. The claim is that, yes, there are more than 2 sexes, that sex is not discrete. Whereas the biological definition of sex is there are just 2 sexes. There's a sex whose reproductive system functions to create large gametes or eggs that are immobile, and there's another sex, males, that's the females. The males have a reproductive system that I use the word designed, although that implies creationism or a divine being, but I'm using shorthand here. A reproductive system that is geared towards producing small mobile gametes. And there is nothing in between. 100, well, not 100%, but 99.982% of humans fall into that spectrum. There's 0.018%, or 1 out of 6,000 people, is an exception to that. Now, whether you say that makes it not a binary, because people say, well, 1 in 6,000, that means there's not 2 discrete sexes, because there's 1 in 6,000 people. And my response to that is that the chance of, when you toss a nickel, that it will fall on its edge instead of heads or tails is 1 in 6,000. It's almost the same. Yet people, when they toss a coin, they don't say, well, heads, tails, or edge, because it's just male or female. So the exceptions to the rule that people produce big immobile gametes or small mobile gametes are very, very few, enough to be able to say that sex is binary. And yet people object to this. They say, well, and they will raise any number of objections, that there are people with genitalia that aren't perfect, for example. I mean, if you are sufficiently lax on this, you can get the percentage of exceptions up to like maybe 1%. But that is including things that aren't part of the definition of sex, like whether your genitals are perfectly formed or not, or whether you have an extra Y chromosome or not. These things are connected with sex, but they're not part of the definition of sex. So, well, let me take two questions. So why do people insist that sex is a binary? Sex is a spectrum when it's really a binary. And I think, this is pretty clear, it's out of sympathy to people whose gender identity is not binary. I mean, because gender is a social construct and it's how you identify sociosexually in your spectrum. And we freely admit that that's much more of a spectrum than sex. I mean, it's like a camel's hump. There are people that are pretty male and people that identify pretty much as female, but there's a number of people that are, binary or even don't consider themselves on the spectrum at all. So if you have sympathy for that attitude, then you may want to say, well, sex is not binary either, because nature has already shown us that there is no binary in sex. In other words, you're imposing onto nature your view of gender. And that's the mistake that people make. And I think that's why this view is so prevalent.
And also why it's so controversial.
Yeah, I'm surprised it is. It wouldn't have been controversial 20 years ago. I mean, this definition of sex has been accepted by biologists as soon as we realized that there were gametes, and And let me just dispel very quickly two misconceptions about the binary notion of sex that people have, and then I'll pass it over to Luana in part two. The first of all, people say, well, biologists invented this definition of sex just to make it a binary because they're transphobes or they're not sympathetic to the views of people who identify as members of gender that aren't fully male or fully female. And that's just wrong. This definition of sex was concocted well before gender activism or the gender movement started. And the reason it makes sense is because defining sex by gamete type is so useful in biology. It makes the difference in investment between females who have to put all their resources in a few eggs and males that can put it in a million sperm. That difference itself explains so much about biology, including the differences in size, ornamentation, behavior of males and females. So it's not only a good definition, but it's one that's better than any other definition because it's so useful. The second misconception I want to dispel is the very common one, is that other parts, things connected with sex, like genitals, aren't binary. You have a fair number, not a millions of them, but a fair number of people born with incomplete genitalia or ambiguous genitalia. And certainly if you look at genitals, they're not binary. But genitals are not part of the definition of sex. So although sex itself is a binary, things connected with sex, like chromosomal types or genitalia or height, those things are not binary. So to attack the binariness of sex based on the non-binariness of things that are connected with sex but aren't part of the definition of sex is a misconception and is wrong.
Thank you, Jerry. Well, he leads well into the next question, which has to do with the difference between human males and females. So the misconception in the piece says all behavioral and psychological differences between human males and females are due to socialization. Luana?
Yeah, so as Jerry was explaining, the very definition of sex, you were either investing a lot in reproduction, females, or very little in reproduction, males, leads to sexual selection acting differentially between sexes. They don't have the same interests. So, and if you think about humans are mammals. In mammals, the female invests even more in offspring than most other creatures. And we have been mammals for 200 million years or so. Sexual selection did not start when we turned humans magically. It has been with us for at least 200 million years, if not more. So if you think about the optimal strategies for males and females, they're going to be different, right? So they're going to be females will have fewer offspring. They must choose well because they have to invest for a long time in each offspring. They don't have an excess of gametes to waste like males do. So the choosiness of females, for example, which is something that very clearly shows in humans. If you ever did online dating, you'll know that, females will select like something like 3-4% of the males, where males select something like 80% of females. So this is very clear that females are choosier about their males. Females are selected to choose males that can either provide them with resources, provide their offspring with resources, have better territories, or are simply stronger. So it depends on the species, exactly what the selection is based on. In humans, certainly, there is differences in how the sexes value resources, right? Like prestige resources. So, being a female president does not gain Hillary Clinton many more mates, but it gains a male that is president many more mates. So there is a big difference, and people will say that this is because we are somehow socialized into that. So somehow females are socialized to go after prestige or after money or after something. But the same kind of behaviors are present in other animals. So many other creatures, including many birds, other mammals, etc., will choose males based on their territories, based on what they can provide to the offspring, based on their strength. So why would humans be the sole exception to this pattern? And one data set that I find really fascinating is that the higher the equality between males and females in a given country, the more different are their behaviors. So, for example, presence in STEM fields is higher in Saudi Arabia than Norway. This was a surprise to me when I first encountered the data. And this is exactly the opposite. If this was about socialization, you would expect that in places where women are truly subjugated to men, they would be not going into the more male-ish professions, and instead you see it the exact opposite. And of course, when people are free to choose, so the more equal the country, also the more economic equality there is, the more freedom there is, the more education opportunity. So people are free to choose what they want to do. Then you see these differences really becoming more accentuated instead of disappearing, which is an argument against socialization being the cause of the differences. And I don't know if Jerry wants to add anything.
Just that, again, neither Luana nor I deny the fact that there is socialization.
Oh, of course, yeah.
I mean, it's probably obvious, more so in the past than in the present. So, all we're saying is that a substantial part of the differences in behavior between men and women are based on evolution, and that can be tested. And the parallel with animals is so striking, especially in the differences in sexual behavior between males and females, that it is hard to think that human sexual behavior is purely a result of conditioning or social pressure.
And why do you think this is such an important issue for the political left? Why do you think demonstrating that all differences between human males and females are due to socialization? Why is that, a hill they want to die on?
Well, it's part of what I call radical egalitarianism, which I think springs from postmodernism, which is part of this infection of biology, as well as Marxism itself, which has a basic view of humans as infinitely malleable. So if you start saying that we're constrained by our biology or by our genes, I mean, males and females basically have the same genes, but they're expressed in very different ways. So in effect, the differences that Luana is talking are genetic. Many of them are genetic in evolution. If you start saying that, then you're coming up against a view of egalitarianism, which is becoming increasingly pervasive in society. All individuals have to be basically genetically the same, all and groups have to be genetically the same, and males and females have to be genetically the same, because once you admit of a difference, that can elide into visions of superiority versus inferiority. Now, neither Luana nor I, take these differences to be indicative of one group or person or race being better or worse than another. We're just saying that these differences exist and they are useful to be cognizant of them. And
also, they don't necessarily reflect the experience of the individual.
Mhm.
The individual can have, traits that seem more masculine because they happen to be, at the tail end of the bell curve that overlaps with the male, trait.
yeah, we make it clear in the paper that we're talking about averages.
Mhm.
Average differences between the sexes. Of course, there are many women who are taller than a lot of men. There are women who are stronger than men. I mean, we don't deny that. It's obvious. It's just that on average, these are average differences that need to be explained. So,
Right. Okay, Jerry. So the next misconception in your piece was this: evolutionary psychology, the study of evolutionary roots of human behavior, is a bogus field based on false assumptions.
yeah, evolutionary psychology is not in good odor today amongst the progressive left. For the same reason that, basically the Luana was talking about, because it implies that we are to some extent on a leash to our genes. Evolutionary psychology is simply the view that our behaviors, preferences, and our thoughts are products of evolutionary biology. Not all of them, but many of them, and many important ones. And sexual behavior is one of those behaviors that's explained by evolutionary psychology. So, although people have no trouble admitting that our bodies are the product of natural selection, and that we carry in our bodies traces of that, our appendix, our wisdom teeth, our backs, any number of are less likely to willing to admit. Brains carry those traces as well, that we have, and sexual behavior is the most palpably obvious. There are many other ones that are, and I'll give a few examples that are probably due to natural selection. It's weird. It's because behavior is different in people's minds from appearance. And a few of I made a list of a few of the traits, and it's in our paper, that are the result, almost certainly the result of natural selection that acted on our ancestors, and it's probably still acting on us today. Sexual behavior, the difference between males being more promiscuous and females being choosy, is the most obvious. But there's other things like sexual jealousy, why men are more sexually jealous of their mates than females are of men. It's because men don't know that they're the father of their offspring. Why do we favor kin more than non-kin? If you're at a playground and somebody looks kind of suspicious and is around the kids, who do the mothers go to first? Their kids, because they're related to them. People favor their kids, and it's in the law. Your kids get first preference at your money, and then it goes down the line. The more related you are to somebody, the more the law recognizes that they have rights for you, but also the more that you care for them. Fear of snakes and spiders is something that's almost certainly ingrained in us by evolution. In other animals, you can give a naive animal that's never been exposed to a snake. You put a snake in a bird cage, the bird will go crazy. It's never seen a snake. It has genes in its body that tells it that this thing is dangerous. And that's why people have this, I think, this innate fear of spiders and snakes. And one of the features that's sort of our behavioral equivalent of a wisdom tooth, that is something that evolved when it was useful but is no longer useful, is our liking for fats and sweets. our ancestors did not have access to those things so much, and they were valuable resources to be consumed. Well, now I got plenty of them, but we still have the genes that tell us that, I mean, something doesn't taste good innately. Evolution favors us making it taste good. I've always said that to a vulture, rotten meat would taste like an ice cream sundae because evolution has molded its tastes to what it needs to have. Same thing with us. Our tastes for sweets and sugars were molded to in our ancestors, and yet we still retain those because we haven't been civilized for very long, and that's why we have so many people with diabetes and so many people that are overweight. So that's a number of examples of traits that have probably evolved by natural selection, part of evolutionary psychology. I used to be a big opponent of evolutionary psychology because it was rather soft when it started, but over time the field has reached a certain level of maturity that I think you have to take it seriously now, because they can test their hypotheses, they can verify them or reject them. And that means that it's a science now. It's a science that needs to be studied, and yet so many people don't pay attention to it. It's very sad.
I couldn't agree more. So Luana, the next misconception is we should avoid studying genetic differences in behavior between individuals.
Yeah, so this is something that I do see sometimes resistance in my students if the trait is a behavioral trait and not a physical trait. So nobody objects the heritability of physical traits like height, hair color, eye color, etc. But when it comes to behaviors, and I think it's the same pervasive blank slate that also causes resistance to sex differences or to evolutionary psychology, because the trait is behavior. We think behaviors are malleable. We can train people. We can teach them. People can learn from societies, etc. Then how can this possibly be heritable? But there are, of course, many ways to study heritability. You know, I think that the most beginning studies would be like the similarity between parents and offspring, which people often assumed it was learned. So, you know, if you like the same thing your parents like, or if you have the same kinds of behaviors or tics or whatnot, it's because you got that from your parents. And then you have adoption studies, right, where we start to see that the adopted children look more like their biological parents than their adoptive parents. So that starts to break this narrative a little bit, but, you know, people tend to ignore it. You know, more recently, they're even able to map some behaviors to the genome. For example, same-sex attraction has been mapped recently. So, you know, and I think that the ones that people have the most resistance to are behaviors that are not desirable behaviors. So, for example, criminality or, you know, aggression, alcoholism, things like that, things that society would prefer that people could escape easily. And it's not to say, this is the best thing, right? It's not to say that it's inevitable, right? Just because something is genetic, it doesn't mean that you can't escape it, right? So if you think of obesity, for example, a person can have an obesity tendency, but that doesn't mean they can't lose weight. So of course, in the past, nobody was obese. So someone that is really determined, no matter their tendencies, they can remain at a healthy weight, even if they have genes that predispose them to gain weight. You know, do you have anything to add, Jerry?
Well, that leads into one of the most radioactive misconceptions out there, which is that race and ethnicity are social constructs without scientific or biological meaning. Luana?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so you know, we see that everywhere, and especially in the media and in the general public. And I think it's, again, this fear that if you admit that there are differences between populations, then you are creating some hierarchy of sorts, which is a fallacy. And in the paper, we make clear that race is a charged term. So we rather not use this term. We rather talk about population structure in humans or differences between ethnicity, not to be tainted by a very racist past, including in science. And races, they're simply referring to genetic differences between geographic populations. So if you go around the world, you will find that different populations have a different set of alleles or gene versions. And if you think like many of us have done 23andMe, and other services, and the reason they can tell you where you came from in the world is because there is a structure. And that doesn't mean that there is a famous sentence that, most humans are 99.999% related to each other, which is absolutely true. But within that variation, there are differences between populations. And even though 85% of the variation is shared between populations, there are 15% that is not. And if you start to focus on the variation, and there is so much variation, about 3 million base pairs are variable in humans, you'll find millions of them that are different between individuals. So 23andMe, if you ever did 23andMe, you know that it can even color your chromosomes by which part of the world they came from. Like, look at the recombinations. If you have a mixed ancestry like I do, you can see parts that came from Europe, parts that came from South America, Africa, etc. And the reason for that is that you have very many unique alleles and allele combinations that are unique to populations. So it's really a no-brainer. And yet you see many, many books that will claim that the difference is just skin dip, it's just about skin color and so on. Which of course, and by the way, this is an important point, traits that have been selected, like skin color, for example, where you want to have lighter skin color where there isn't enough sun so you can acquire vitamin D, darker skin color, there is a lot of light, and a lot of light can not only cause cancer, but destroy some kinds of vitamins as well. Then there is selection for differences in skin color. Those differences that were under selection will build up much faster, and you're going to have even more differences for these kinds of traits. So skin color is a prime example where most of the differences in the world are not actually shared between populations or races. They're contained within geographic locations, which are associated with solar exposure.
So what do you think would be the positive social outcome of studying the differences amongst ethnicities from a biological standpoint?
So I think that, first of all, you're going to understand unique alleles that exist in one population and not others. So for example, the causes of disease, the same disease, heart, for example, heart conditions, can be different depending on the population you're looking at. So there are so many genes involved in some conditions that to understand the underlying causes of these conditions, you need to understand what's there, and therefore you need to understand population structure. And there are lots of research going on in population structure. 23andMe depends on that, of course. It gets way more controversial if you start to look at, again, behaviors and things that might be associated with location. So that is the area that there is very little research. And for some reasons, there are technical as well. It's very hard. If you do, for example, if you're trying to map something, let's say education attainment has been mapped in white European populations recently, because each population has a unique set of genes, what you do for one population does not apply, at least as well, to other populations. So if you have, for example, for education attainment, you have, I think, 15% predictability within a population. If you get those same loci and you apply to another population, let's say Asians or Africans, that predictability falls to less than 3%. So it becomes it's non-transferable. So if you understand the causes of education attainment in all populations, you need to study that in separate in different populations.
Okay, this is the last misconception. Jerry, it's yours. Indigenous ways of knowing are equivalent to modern science and should be respected and taught as such.
Well, this is a assertion that comes out, like most of these assertions, that comes out of people meaning well, caring for other people, caring for minorities, caring for those who've been oppressed in the past. And some of those people are indigenous people. I mean, look, we treated Native Americans pretty bad, and they still have it pretty bad. And the Maori in New Zealand, which I particularly pay attention to because I love New Zealand, is another group that was oppressed for many years. So people care about these people, and that's good that they do. What that should not lead to, however, is to take their ways of knowing, how they regard the world, how they see the universe, and say that those have to be respected as much as Western science does. So in New Zealand, for example, and I'll use that as my main example, the Maori people, which I think are about 17–18% of the population, have a way of knowing called Mataranga Maori, which is, it's basically the way of knowing of the Maori. And it includes as some practical knowledge, some practical wisdom, when to harvest eels, when to pick berries, and of course, the knowledge of how to navigate by the stars that got the ancestors of the Maori to New Zealand from Polynesia, which was a fantastic feat. I can't imagine how many ships were lost in the trial and error method that led them to do that. But this is now turning into the view that Mataranga Maori, it's an official government policy now, has to be taught as co-equal with modern science. They call it Western science, but that's a misnomer because science belongs to the world, not to the West. But that these indigenous ways of knowing, and this is also true in Canada and for Native Americans, have to be regarded as co-equal with modern science. Now, there are bits of real science in Mataranga Maori. The various empirical observations that people have made when trying to live their lives and eat and forage and things like that. But Mataranga Maori also includes superstition, tradition, religion, morality, all kinds of things that are not part of modern science and yet are trying to be made into part of modern science. So when the government decrees that you have to teach this indigenous way of knowing as co-equal to modern science, they're lumping in a whole bunch of superstition along with science. And that superstition is harmful to the extent that it will damage the children's understanding of science. And it's already, this kind of view is already making the museum plummet against its competitors educationally. So what I'm saying is that, well, we need to respect and perhaps give reparations to people that have been oppressed in the past. We should not take their way of knowing as something sacred, as something that we cannot criticize, as something that we have to say is on the same plane as modern science. This is probably the least important of the 6 points, but it's not so unimportant in New Zealand, where the educational system is falling apart, particularly because of this, where there's a movement now to return to the herbal healing ways of the Maori and get rid of so-called Western medicine. And that's only going to be harmful because none of these herbal medicines have been tested in a scientific way, double-blind testing. That's the gold standard of science. So
what has happened to scientists who have tried to investigate these areas that are so controversial? What have been the experiences of people who are in these fields, who are just trying to do their scientific work, but suddenly find themselves in the center of a maelstrom?
I'll start with mine, and Luana's got a lot more, I think. If you say that there are only 2 sexes, you can be fired. In fact, that's what, it wasn't really. Carol Hooven, who's a researcher at Harvard, was basically hounded out of her position as an anthropologist by teaching that there were two sexes. A woman in Maine, a professor, maintained that there were only two sexes. They took her class away from her and gave it to another professor. And, textbooks are being changed now to say, well, maybe sex is a spectrum, etc. So that's just one small example of being punished for maintaining something that's true. And I think Luana probably has a ton more of examples of people that have suffered because of it.
Well, if you pay attention, we see evidence of that everywhere. There are professors that have been suspended for talking about differences between human groups. There are professors that there are so many that oftentimes is people in the public, right? There was a nurse that was suspended and didn't get her license because she didn't check the sex non-binary thing. There is like a lot of these examples out there. Some of them might have other things in between, so it's hard to quantify how many of them truly were is strictly due to their, for example, saying sexes are binary versus there was something else as well, like they weren't liked in the school, so they used that to actually fire the person. There is definitely some confusion there because not example is crystal clear, but definitely people who are trying to study these things, and then you have like even some restrictions on studying populations in which you do not belong. I have a friend that has studied humans, and in one of the conferences he went to, there was pressure that if you were studying a group in which you didn't belong, you must include an author of that group, or else you couldn't present your results, for example. And this kind of pressure, which is weird, right? We study all kinds of creatures. We are not. Right, it's like you don't have to be part of a group to study a group necessarily. No, so yeah, we see a lot of that.
Yeah,
Well,
you go ahead, Robyn. You must.
Well, we have a little over 10 minutes left, and I think I'm going to go to some of the many questions that we have accumulated. So I'm going to start, considering we were talking about genetic studies, with a question by Vassal. And this is what he writes. Regarding genetic studies of educational attainment, what do you make of arguments that the genome-wide association studies, the GWAS, are basically fishing expeditions where data is, quote, hopelessly noisy, and correlations are essentially just by chance?
I would disagree with that very much. I mean, if you, first of all, you can repeat studies, you can do studies with other populations. I mean, I think that the education attainment path, evolutionary path, if you will, with the first study coming out in 2013, and then more studies coming out in 15, 18, and 22, show that the loci, the genes that were initially very significant, in the first study, only 3, because there were few data, like fewer individuals, they remained significant later on. So you're dealing with so many individuals, and if you think of, I think it's easier to understand GWAS if you think of a binary trait, has the disease, doesn't have the disease. You do a well-designed study where the individuals that are in the in group and the control group are from the same genetic group, so from the same ethnicity, then the associations that are going to come and be significant, and they have to be highly significant to be showing, they're repeatable. It's like, in some terms, in the way that you don't know exactly what you're going to encounter when you start one of those studies, one
Right.
can say it's a fishing expedition, but I don't think that the data you get is spurious and just random.
Okay, we have a question from Reinhold who says, would it not be sensible to think of indigenous knowledge as complementary to scientific thinking, and that some herbal remedies are even in use today?
Yeah, what was the first part of that?
Wouldn't
Compliment.
it be sensible to think of indigenous knowledge as complementary?
I have two responses to that before we get to the second part. The first is that what is considered indigenous knowledge is often a pastiche of real knowledge, like the eels show up about this time. That is part of science. It's not complementary science. It's scientific, empirically determined knowledge. That is science. But the indigenous, what goes under the rubric of indigenous knowledge is not just that kind of empirical stuff. It is a mixture of superstition, of religion, of morality, of knowledge of ways to live. And so when you talk about knowledge, you have to take the scientific wheat away from the spiritual chaff and throw away the chaff, and the wheat becomes part of science. It's a worldwide thing. So I don't think it's complementary to science. I think it is science, and that science is one big gemish of things that happen to be true. The second part about plants, what was the question exactly?
Just that there are herbal remedies that have been found to have uses today that were obviously ancestral remedies as well.
Absolutely true. I mean, I can think of two of them. The bark of the willow, salix, was the source of aspirin. And I guess it was chewed by people in the olden days as a relief from pain. And cinchona bark is the source of quinine and has been a remedy for malaria. In fact, I think that like 25% of the drugs that we use on the pharmacy shelf had their origins in botanical literature. Not all of them from indigenous people. A lot of times somebody will send somebody from the United States out to get a bunch of plants in some place and then test them for their efficacy. But what is important is that it's indisputable that indigenous knowledge has contributed towards our pharmacopoeia. But in order to see that these drugs really are efficacious, that quinine really does cure malaria, that aspirin does relieve pain, you have to use modern scientific methods, and that means double-blind studies. So you can't just take the word of a group that's living somewhere, say in the Amazon, and say, you know, this is good for this. That's a trial and error thing. But before we can start prescribing it to people in general, we have to test it according to the rules of modern science. So again, that it's not complementary to science, it's the lead-in to scientific knowledge. And in that sense, it's important. So I'm not trying to say that we should ignore what indigenous people know. It's just that we should not bow down before everything that they say they know. For example, Mataranga Maori, part of its legend is that the Polynesians discovered Antarctica in the 8th century AD. Now, that's just completely bogus. It cannot happen. Not only that, but they discovered it in canoes made of human bones. And it all comes from the mistranslation of an oral legend transmitted by that. Nevertheless, they were given $600,000 to study this legend. So that's the kind of thing that results when you start taking for granted the claims of indigenous people and are afraid to test them. That's the thing. The idea that we need to test these claims is regarded as odious because in some sense it's thought of as being colonialistic or patronizing. So.
And the Maori have a lot of mythology in their quote unquote science as well. It's like a new form of creationism that's found its way into science curriculum when were it the biblical story of creation, you know, I'm sure that would be found wanting.
Yeah, I mean, it is true. And the reason that people don't speak up against it is because they're afraid to be called racists or colonialists. I mean, as all true liberals have a deep-seated fear of being called a racist, a colonialist, or an oppressor. So one of the greatest weapons of the people who espouse these fallacies that we talked about is the fear that we have of being called names. Right. You know, and I just think, and the one I make this point in our paper, we got to get over that. We have to stand up for what we think is true. We cannot pay attention to the possibility that we'll be called names for standing up for what is true.
So we have a question from Michael Bigelow, who says, I'm inclined to think this is a uniquely American issue that will fade in the face of reason and science. Is this something that in 20 years will be looked at as a sad bit of Americana? Or if it goes unchecked, does American academia really have the power to alter the course of science on a global level?
This is a great question. And I was contacted by a number of Brazilian scientists thanking me for writing this article, because they are observing now, very recently, but they are observing within the past 5 years, similar kinds of things, especially about the sex binary intruding into Brazil now. You know, that Brazil, I know Brazil well because I grew up there, it tends to import everything from the US. So there is a lag, but they tend to import everything. And I believe that's true for many other countries as well. So there is a risk that what starts in the US ends up global, right? It's like it's the globalization thing. So it's one more reason why we have to push back against that.
Yeah, you know, Robyn, how many people have asked to translate this article from English into, I think, Spanish and
German.
Yeah, but many languages. I mean, to me, that means that these countries have the same problem we do, and we know they do because there are other articles. Luana and I were authors on another article by Abbott et al. That was published in a journal of, I can't remember the name, Peter Singer's journal.
Controversial ideas.
Controversial ideas. That this problem is global. It's not the United States. So whether it's going to go away.
And the Anglosphere is particularly affected, but it's present, it's spreading very fast. Certainly present in Australia, New Zealand, the indigenous knowledge thing is very much so. I heard from an Australian person that they have to do the land acknowledgements and indigenous acknowledgements before every class, before their classes start at the university. So, you know, it's like a new religion spreading.
The new religion.
New Zealand, it's particularly bad. I write a lot about New Zealand on my website about the problems they're having, both with indigenous knowledge and just disrespected science in general. And every day, without fail, I get emails from New Zealanders who say, I'm with you, brother, but I can't speak up because if I say what you say, I'm going to be fired. So a lot of academics in New Zealand agree with me about the co-equality of science and indigenous ways of knowing, but they dare not speak out. And this is another reason we published our paper, to try to hearten people to join us and speak out. You know, now the reason Luana is braver than I am is because I'm an emeritus. I have nothing to lose by saying what I think. She's still a young and active researcher, so you know she risks more. Although fortunately, she's well protected by her university, so she's not going to suffer, I hope.
Well, then a call out to Williams College. Well chosen, Luana. So I have a question here from Richard Dawkins, and he asks, why do you think there is such a sharp age discontinuity in opinions in this area? Young people seem almost guaranteed to think that sex is non-binary.
Well, it's just the way the politics breaks. Young people have been brought up in the regime that, who was it, Haidt and Luciano, for a book about the something of the American mind, in which they talk about how starting in about 1980, children began to be subject to a different kind of educational regime where they had helicopter parents, where they were taught things like whatever kills you makes you weaker, rather than
whatever doesn't kill you makes you weaker. Right. You get a participation trophy just for showing up. Yeah.
Well, sensitivity regime began about then. And so I think it's just a generational difference.
The coddling of the American mind.
Well, the American mind.
Yeah.
should read that.
Excellent.
Yeah, so that would be mine.
And they are also immersed in cancel culture, right? It's like they are all in Instagram, in Facebook, in Twitter, you name it, and people are watching. I mean, it's really something. Like if you we had a few times of uproar in my campus, and the students would come to me and say, "Look, I have to show up to this demonstration. If I don't show up, they'll say I'm sexist, I'm racist, I'm transphobic, I'm this, I'm that. I have to." So there is, they are under surveillance, if you will. Like,
And there are colleges, and we all know that most colleges are quite liberal, and that 90% of college faculty is liberal. So students are marinated in this sort of liberal progressivism. They don't get a chance to hear the other side very often. So that's also a difference. Whereas when I was brought up in college, there was that kind of liberalism was not as pervasive as it is now. So,
well, we have sped through an hour. So let's just leave on a hopeful note, okay? Where do you see glimmers of hope? Do you think we have reached the peak of this kind of craziness and are now back to moving back towards reason and moorings in rationality rather than ideology?
I actually do see some reasons for hope. I see more and more people that are reaching their tipping point, and they're saying, enough is enough. And when they reach that point, and they realize that, a movement that we all agree with, like social justice, all these moves that are largely behind egalitarianism and equality, equity, and so on. And when you realize that this is transforming and it's morphing into a very authoritarian, system, you can start pushing back. So I think that the more people realize that, the more they will start pushing back. And I do see several people recently that came talk to me and said, I'm only seeing this now. I'm starting to see it among my students, and the more people start to see it, the more hope we have that we can turn the tide. So there is hopes, I think.
I'm not quite as optimistic as Luana, but that's because I'm an Ashkenazi Jew of the secular variety, and my genes have been selected for always looking around for the next pogrom. So I hope things will change, but I don't know. I think I may be dead before they go back to what they used to be.
Well, then
it won't go back to the way it used to be. I mean,
well,
in full circles, right? But it could go in a spiral.
Well, if you feel the need to make another pass at this subject, Skeptical Inquirer is always there to publish it. We couldn't be happier that you chose us to get out the word and raise the alarm. So thank you to Jerry and Luana for this terrific evening. And a special thank you to everyone in the audience for joining us this evening, especially those of you who are members and supporters of the Center for Inquiry. We could not be a force for reason and science without you. A shout out to Mike Powell for his technical support this evening, and to Barry Carr for producing the Skeptical Inquirer Presents series. This episode will be posted on the Skeptical Inquirer Presents website tomorrow. And I just wish you all a good evening and happy reading.
Thank you.
Thank you.